Hello, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research. My talk tonight will be dedicated to the art of Japanese calligraphy. This art form, especially its modern manifestation, tends to be overlooked by mainstream art historical narratives due to its double marginalization. On the one hand, it is an East Asian art, which historically has been underrepresented in the European field of art history and its institutions. But furthermore, it is an art form which does not have a direct analog in the European art system, unlike, for example, painting or sculpture. And this makes it especially prone to being discounted. Despite this double marginalization, in the post-war period, calligraphers left a significant footprint in the global avant-garde. My book, which is called Bokujinkai, Japanese Calligraphy and the Postwar Avant-Garde, which recently has been published by Brill in the Japanese Visual Culture series, is dedicated to the phenomenon of postwar avant-garde calligraphy from Japan and its impact on the abstract art movement in Japan, in the United States, and in Europe. In this book, but also in my talk tonight, I argue that post-war calligraphers spearheaded several distinctive visual and theoretical trends, such as focus on linear monochrome abstraction, attention to movement and speed, and incorporating language and script into visual arts, soon to be picked up by post-war artists across the globe. Tonight, we will be looking at the history of encounters between Japanese avant-garde calligraphers and international abstract painters, and I would like to start with comparing two exhibitions. In 1954, an exhibition of modern Japanese calligraphy at the Museum of Modern Art in New York was on display simultaneously with the show of young American painters at the Guggenheim. An art critic from the Washington Post, Leslie Judd Portner, compared these two shows, saying that perhaps the most interesting thing about the exhibitions in New York is the strength of the Oriental influence. Not only it is apparent at the Museum of Modern Art, but also at the showing of young American painters at the Guggenheim. A great majority of the works on view there belong to the Abstract Expressionist school, and the influence of calligraphy is astoundingly strong. In fact, it would be quite easy to exchange several examples of Japanese calligraphy at the Museum of Modern Art with some of the younger American at the Guggenheim, without drastically changing the mood of the either show, end quote. These images shown in these exhibitions, but also reviews by the critics, suggest that in the post-war years, it was common to look at Japanese calligraphy through the lens of abstract painting and to regard these two art forms as interconnected. Whether Japanese calligraphy was related to American abstract expressionism with Mark Tobey or Franz Klein in its lead, or to European Informel with Hans Hartung and Pierre Soulages, depended on the exhibition's context and location. And indeed, we will later look at some other exhibition which contextualize this art form very differently. Nevertheless, the link between calligraphy and abstract painting was generally accepted, which might seem surprising today. In this talk, I will look at the dynamics of interaction between avant-garde calligraphers from Japan and abstract artists from the United States and Europe. In particular, I will discuss how their interaction was shaped by the intellectual environment of Zen boom of the 1950s and 60s. Let us take a step back and think about the historical context of the visual encounter between calligraphy and abstract painting. It is very interesting to look at the interplays between politics and art in the global cultural system of the 1950s and 60s, especially through the lens of calligraphy. Why calligraphy and not painting? Because calligraphy and painting did not follow the same trajectories in the post-war years. There existed fierce competition between the American and European schools of abstraction, which made abstract painting an extremely politicized art form. Japanese artists and curators, who were disconnected from the development in contemporary painting for several decades due to political reasons, found it hard to reconnect to it instantaneously, and contemporary Japanese painting was not regarded high right after the end of the Second World War. This was very different from minor art forms from Japan, especially those that did not have European counterparts, which were met with appreciation and genuine interest. For example, you might know of the post-war breakthrough of avant-garde ceramics, creative prints, or avant-garde ikebana, but also calligraphy fits into this pattern. It was easier for European and American artists to see sources of different aesthetical thinking and inspiration in these previously marginalized art forms and not to take them competitively, as it was the case with painting. Unlike painting, they also were not considered derivative by European and American critics. Hence, for a rather brief point in time, calligraphy received unprecedented international visibility and was in some occasion, instead of painting, representing Japanese arts in the most prestigious art venues. But I would like to briefly discuss what was the driving force for Japanese calligraphers to aspire international recognition and what was at stake for them in the rapidly transforming system of post-war Japanese arts. As some of you may know, in the process of major transformations, calligraphy was excluded from the official Bijutsu fine art system, and since then, the status of this art form has been rather precarious in Japan. In the immediate post-war years, it was questioned even further, this time from the outside. Democratization, a political rallying call of the late 1940s and early 50s, formed the historical background for calligraphers' orientation towards international public. It was used as a general term for an entire range of various reforms that were supposed to impact the deeper structures of the Japanese society. Many of the reforms targeted Japan's domestic spheres, such as culture, education, and language, directly touching upon calligraphers' field of activity. For example, the post-war language reform initiated by the Allies suggested radical simplification of Japanese script up to total elimination of characters. The United States Education Mission to Japan concluded its activity in 1946 with a report stating that, quote, "The present Japanese writing system is an important factor in preventing the development of an adequately informed electorate required for the proper functioning of a democratic system. At present, the Japanese written language stifles independent and original thinking on the part of the average Japanese, a process so necessary to the healthy development of a democracy." End quote. It was suggested to radically simplify Japanese script by eliminating characters and switching to the katakana alphabet or even to Roman letters. Furthermore, calligraphy was excluded by the occupation authorities from the school curriculum as useless and outdated subject between 1946 and 1949. These developments made Japanese calligraphers reconsider their public position, previously ignorant of the processes taking place in the official culture and arts, and to think of the ways how to reintegrate calligraphy into visual culture of modern Japan. With survival of calligraphy endangered by the latest political trends, the necessity to do so became obvious to most of the calligraphic community. Starting from the late 1940s, a new generation of calligraphers launched large-scale transformation of this art form, aiming at restoring its public prominence and visual appeal in the arts community. This is how a new type of calligraphy, avant-garde calligraphy Zen-Eisho, was formed. The most evident characteristic of this new calligraphic direction was the permanent tendency to increasingly separate calligraphy from the verbal meaning, from the character. Next, Japanese calligraphers aspired to show their art to the international art community in order to be included into the global art exchange and gain negotiation power back in Japan. In the 1950s, they came very close to their goal. In 1952, a Japanese calligraphy group, Bokujinkai, or group of people of the ink, was formed in Kyoto by 5 calligraphers, including Morita Shiryū, Inoue Yūichi, Eguchi Sōgen, Nakamura Bokushi, and Sekiya Yoshimichi. From the moment of the group's formation, the Bokujinkai called for cooperation and parity with European and American abstract painters. To demonstrate this, they put a reproduction of Franz Klein's painting on the cover of first issue of their journal. Abstract painters and their audiences in Japan and abroad welcomed and encouraged these innovations. The international orientation of the young post-war generation of calligraphers could be seen in the Bokujinkai's founding manifesto. Quote, "A great future is opening for calligraphy. European and American avant-gardists, progressive Japanese critics, and artists keep knocking on calligraphy's doors. The world of calligraphy, which has been long hibernating in the shell of authoritarianism, is finally being shaken from outside. Calligraphic art, which has preserved a long tradition in a remote corner of the East, has finally come into sight of the world. But will it resurge as a truly modern art, or will it be abandoned and self-destruct after the progressive artist absorbs its essence? We're now standing at this crossroad. Seeing this, we cannot lose even one day. The vision of calligraphy's internationalization was at the very core of post-war avant-garde calligraphy practices. The wish to see calligraphy appreciated beyond Japan or East Asia was a vision that stimulated and motivated post-war calligraphers, and in their eyes, the global trend for abstraction in painting opened a great future for calligraphy. Morita Shiryū, one of the leaders of the Bokujinkai group, used a metaphor of a rainbow to describe his vision of the contact between calligraphy and abstract painting. Formulated in 1948, the concept of the rainbow represents Japanese calligraphy and Euro-American abstract painting as a colorful rainbow, quote, standing with one leg in the west and the other one in the east, end quote. While they come from various grounds, these two art forms join together in the skies, forming a beautiful rainbow of the new art together. This image guided the Bokujinkai from the moment of the group's formation. The idea of the rainbow inspired Morita throughout his life as a calligrapher, and he often created calligraphers with the character rainbow or niji, like this one from 1975. In accordance with his theoretical idea, this calligraphy is made for looking more than for reading, since it is extremely difficult to discern the actual character amidst the dense dynamic brushwork. Morita focused on the expressive flow of abstracted lines, which he perceived as universal art language, understood both in Japan and abroad. This style later became a hallmark of Bokujinkai's avant-garde. It were not only calligraphers who strived for calligraphy's international success. Also, avant-garde painters like Yoshihara Jiro of the Gutai group, foreign abstractionists like Georges Mathieu, Pierre Lishinsky, and Japanese Zen philosophers, including Hisamatsu Shinichi and Eiji Matsutomo, encouraged radical experimentation with the language. For example, Zen philosopher of the Kyoto school, Hisamatsu Shinichi, wrote that only after calligraphy will break from the character will it be able to move to representing the self-awareness of the active formless self and will become a unique and accomplished manifestation of the abstract art from the East, end quote. You might hear the reverberations of the post-war Zen boom here. Stimulated and guided by such remarks, calligraphers started challenging virtually all aspects of their art, creating works in oil and canvas, experimented with colors and shapes, made printed calligraphy, made references to contemporary French avant-garde poetry, music, and more. Guided by prominent art historians and theoreticians, the enthusiastic reformist attitudes of calligraphers and their international networking strategies brought them world fame very quickly. Ambiguous images, neither painting nor writing, fitted well into the post-war calligraphic abstraction and enriched the reference palette of the abstract artists from the United States and Europe. For example, works of Hidai Nankoku, Edo Sokyu, and some other calligraphers were purchased by the Museum of Modern Art in New York and exhibited at the São Paulo Biennale, Documenta in Kassel, Mitchell Gallery in New York, Museum Czernosky in Paris, and in many other locations across Europe, United States, but also Australia and South America. Furthermore, the Bokujinkai calligraphers actively collaborated with foreign artists, including Franz Klein, who received Bokubi journals regularly and assisted in organizing some of the calligraphers' exhibitions in the United States, with Pierre Soulages, who went to Japan in 1958 and participated in public discussions with calligraphers, with Pierre Lishinsky, who created a movie dedicated to avant-garde calligraphy in Japan in 1956, with Georges Mathieu, who visited the Gutai group together with Michel Tapier and made public announcements about his relation to calligraphy, and many more. When trying to understand the phenomenal international success of the Bokujinkai's calligraphy, it is important to consider it in association with the broader post-war intellectual fashion for Zen, or Zen boom of the 1950s to the 1970s. Drawing on the international demand for Zen as an alternative philosophical system, calligraphers reached their largest international audience by referencing Zen subjects. Attention to Zen philosophy introduced new dimensions to the international reception of East Asian art, bringing its relation to East Asia spiritualities such as Zen and Taoism into the spotlight. Relation to Zen offered a lens through which post-war Japanese art, including calligraphy, was perceived outside of Japan. The photograph of the exhibition of modern Japanese calligraphy at Museum Chernovsky in Paris in 1956 pointedly illustrates this trend. The French photographer selected a very unusual yet telling perspective. The works of post-war calligraphers, along with French viewers looking at them, are depicted from the perspective of a large Buddhist statue situated in the same room. The hands of the Buddha placed in the mudra float over the modern calligraphers and the visitors looking at them as if blessing both. This photographic solution aimed to advertise the exhibition from the perspective held by European and American audience on the art of modern calligraphy in the 1950s, namely its connection to Buddhism. Esotericized and mystified, the art of calligraphy thus gained a whiff of enigmatic wisdom, supported by the difficulty for European and American audiences of reading Japanese script. To challenge the challenge of understanding calligraphy, of internalizing the foreign language and visual art tradition, was at the very heart of its appeal for post-war audiences. Aware of this trend, the Bokujinkai calligraphers emphasized the religious and philosophical dimensions of their art and its links to Zen Buddhism. To ensure that they adhered to narratives familiar to the international public, the Bokujinkai closely collaborated with Zen scholars of the Kyoto School of Philosophy, most importantly Hisamatsu Shinichi and Iji Matsutomo. For showing what I mean, I suggest to look at one example, namely the reception of works by Sengai Gibon. This Edo period Japanese monk of the Rinzai school was simultaneously a prominent calligrapher, painter, and a poet. In the post-war years, his art enjoyed great attention both in Japan and abroad. The case of Sengai is particularly interesting because his art was introduced to a wide audience almost simultaneously in Japan, United States, and Europe. This took place in 1956 when the first large exhibition dedicated specifically to Sengai was opened at the Oakland City Art Museum in California. It would be inaccurate to say that Sengai was completely unknown in Japan before that, but his role in the history of Japanese art and his contribution were perceived as peripheral until this watershed exhibition. Sengai's now canonical circle, triangle, and square is a showcase example of transcultural circulation of Zen iconography in the most post-war decades, and this work had its public debut at the Oakland exhibition. And it was introduced to the Japanese public even later than it was to European and American audiences. This intriguing image, which is neither painting nor calligraphy, became a trademark of Japanese Zen Buddhism abroad. After traveling around the world, being exhibited in Japan several times, and appearing repeatedly in catalogs and books in multiple languages, Sengai's circle, triangle, and square firmly entered the visual consciousness of the post-war generations of artists and viewers worldwide. There are many interpretations of its meaning, yet probably the most popular was suggested by proselytizer of post-war international Zen and colleague of Hisamatsu, Suzuki Daisetsu. Suzuki suggested that Sengai's image stands for the entire universe and shows a diagram of Buddhist enlightenment, or Satori. Suzuki became so inspired by Sengai's ideas that he created his own work based on Sengai, and which was more precisely visualized his own understanding of it. Unlike Sengai's original work, Suzuki's interpretation of the subject of circle, triangle, and square is articulated predominantly verbally. It explicitly refers to the classical Buddhist text of the Heart Sutra that reads, "Form is nothing else than emptiness." And in this work, Suzuki replaced some characters with geometric forms borrowed from Sengai. The Bokujinkai noticed very early that Suzuki, a central figure in the post-war Zen establishment, had become profoundly interested in Sengai. Issue 151 of Bokubi was dedicated to the exhibition of Sengai in Europe, and besides featuring circle, triangle, and square on its cover, it also included Suzuki's English language introduction to Sengai's European exhibition. Following the international success of Sengai's work, the Bokujinkai dedicated 4 special issues of their journal to this artist within 3 years. Such close attention to Sengai's work had an impact on the calligraphers' own productions. In 1959, only 3 years after the public presentation of Sengai's Circle, Triangle, and Square, Tejima Yuke created his work called Writing Poetry Looking at the Moon, or Gingetsu. While the title and the meaning of the phrase do not show any connection to Sengai's concept, the shape of the character Gin, or writing poetry, was remodeled in a way that clearly recalls the geometrical figures of Sengai's circle, triangle, and square. Tejima must therefore have been aware of the international attention Sengai's art was starting to enjoy, because he selected this work for the second Kassel Documenta in 1959. Mindful of the European viewers' inability to read his calligraphy, Tejima appealed to them by highlighting its visual and not linguistic connection to Sengai and Japanese Zen Buddhism. But it was not just the Japanese calligraphers who felt the cultural right and ability to artistically embrace Sengai's visual legacy. European and American abstract painters also started adopting Sengai's iconography, as for example, Belgian abstractionist Pierre Alishinsky in his 1960 work Universe. With triangle, circle, and square in the center of the composition, surrounded by squares with abstract scenes, this work makes a direct allusion to Sengai. As Alishinsky stated later, quote, "I rediscover his gesture, the gesture of my master Sengai," end quote. However, the elements in Alishinsky's work appear in a different order. Looking in the Japanese manner from right to left, in this version, the triangle and not circle comes first. This is an important detail that will be repeated by other European and American painters. It is also noteworthy that the title of Alishinsky's work, Universe, directly derives from Suzuki's interpretation. It is thus possible to suggest that the information that Alishinsky had about Sengai was mediated by Suzuki. Other artists who embraced Sengai's iconography included Walter de Maria with his 1972 work Triangle, Circle, and Square, and Robert Motherwell with his Untitled from 1985. Curiously, all of them placed the elements in the same order as Alishinsky, with circle in the middle, which speaks for the inheritance of the interpretation among European and American abstract artists and their shared visual and intellectual Zen lineage. The Zen calligraphers and international painters shared an interest in the traditional Japanese Zen legacy, represented by Sengai Gibon's art, which offered fruitful common ground for their artistic exchange. Artists in Japan and abroad received information about Sengai's circle, triangle, and square at the same time and through the mediation of the same related modernized Zen philosophies of Suzuki and Hisamatsu. Thus, calligraphers and painters began their attempts to embrace Sengai's art almost simultaneously, a circumstance unique in the history of art interactions between Japan, Europe, and the United States, and one of the most prominent moments of early post-war globalization in the arts. The inspirational example of Sengai and its international resonance reconfirmed the Bokujinkai in the importance of Zen for their art. In response to the prominent allusions to Zen in international abstract painting, the appealing rhetoric of Hisamatsu Shinichi and calligraphy's historical connections to Zen, The Bokujinkai artists gradually started essentializing the philosophical and religious implications of their calligraphy. Convinced that understanding Zen was an inherent component of Japanese calligraphy, the Bokujinkai artists treated Zen aspirations coming from outside of Japan as unworthy of serious consideration. In their discussions of Zen and arts or on spirituality of calligraphy, they did not even mention the Zen-inspired works of the international counterparts, such as Universe by Lisinski, whom he knew very well personally and who went to Japan to create a film together with Bokujinkai calligraphers. All that the Bokujinkai artists had to say about the Zen-inspired works of their international peers can be summarized in the following statement by Eiji Matsutomo, quote, "Contemporary artists are looking very attentively at Japanese calligraphy. In various art theories and in many works of painting, they seem to try to master it. But if you ask me honestly, they do not master it at all." End quote. Thus, while modernized Zen philosophy provided an initial point of contact between Japanese calligraphers and European and American abstract painters, using it as a guiding principle for their cooperation turned out to be rather harmful than useful. The concealed nationalistic agenda of Hisamatsu and Suzuki's modernized Zen created new obstacles for the productive exchange between these two art groups. Since the Bokujinkai's dynamics increasingly relied on Hisamatsu's narratives from the early 1960s, Morita Shiryū's writings and visual endeavors resonated with modern Zen rhetoric to become impenetrably metaphysical. This development triggered the conservative turn within the Bokujinkai and their subsequent self-withdrawal from the international art exchange. The moment of conservative turn within the Bokujinkai group can be seen in one series by Inoue Yūichi. The unparalleled international success, along with euphoria, created a pressure for Japanese calligraphers to experiment even more fiercely and to more actively address abstraction in their works. As a culmination of this trend, in 1955, Inoue Yūichi started creating abstract images deprived of any reference to characters, even in their title. An example of such work is work A, which he prepared for the traveling exhibition Contemporary Japanese Calligraphy in Europe. It is an entirely abstract image consisted of numerous dynamic brushstrokes, which seem to be applied to the white background without any pattern. Furthermore, he used enamel instead of ink, also challenging the materials of calligraphy. There is a photograph that captured the writing process by Inoue as he was making this work, or a very similar one. The inner state of the artist during the process of such intense artistic action is emotionally described in his diary. Quote, June 8. It is horrible. I made several large works and all of them are hopeless. Sweat is in my eyes and I don't see anything. I can't control this chaos. Metallic sound of jazz, dynamism. What is calligraphy? I need to throw away all philosophies. Shall I write with coal tar, with zinc, iron sheet, wood, stone brick? I have to devote everything to the exhibition in Europe. End quote. Exactly this image of the half-naked calligrapher stretched in an acrobatic movement, smeared in black paint and with a strange facial expression, attracted attention of the wider public even more than the abstract calligraphy works themselves. It was one of Inoue Yūichi's calligraphies, but exactly this photo that made it onto the cover of the weekly Asahi journal and made Inoue Yūichi famous. The abstraction of avant-garde calligraphy was at the same time the culmination of the decade of search and experimentation, but also a turning point of the calligraphy's quest for internationalization. In his Abstract Calligraphers, Inoue stumbled over definitions. What happens to calligraphy when it is separated from writing? Is script and characters a means of expression for calligraphy, or is it calligraphy's primary role to reaffirm and visually represent script? And finally, how can calligraphy be defined? After reaching the point of abstraction, the main task of calligraphers was to justify the independence of their art form and its difference from abstract painting. And thus the fact that after radical experiments with abstraction, calligraphers returned to more directly representing characters in the late 1950s was predictable. Without being able to resolve the problem of calligraphy's incorporation of abstraction, stepping backwards was the only way to go for post-war calligraphers. Even Inoue, after a brief period of abstraction, returned to representing characters around late 1956, and other Bokujinkai calligraphers welcomed this development in Inoue's works and celebrated this as a rediscovery of characters, or moji no saihaken. This was the next milestone in the development of post-war calligraphy. From this point on, even if characters of avant-garde calligraphy were distorted beyond the point of readability, reference to the characters became an obligatory part of avant-garde calligraphy. In fact, this marked the beginning of the Bokujinkai's conservative turn and the final absorption of the group's visual experimentation by the defensive metaphysical rhetoric. Art critic Takiguchi Shuzo noticed this shift as well, and he wrote, quote, "While they seem to have departed from the calligraphic tradition, they haven't really done so. Rather, they are faithfully trying to protect the border of calligraphy from the world of painting." End quote. Ironically, this orientation shift within Japanese calligraphy coincided with the global political conservative turn. With the unfolding Cold War, the art community of Japan, but also of the United States and Europe, became increasingly inward-looking. This phenomenon Bert Winter Tamaki calls artistic nationalism, when art is considered to represent national identity. Within this rhetoric, it was not encouraged by critics and art institutions to create hybrid art forms, but instead to keep the separations intact and to remain within one's own cultural realm. As an example, from the late 1950s, Franz Klein started denying his interest in calligraphy, but also Bokujinkai calligraphers, after Inoue's return to characters, started to use increasingly metaphysical Zen rhetoric, representing calligraphy as a quintessence of Japanese spirituality, inaccessible to foreigners. However, the international activity of Japanese calligraphers did not stop there, and they continued to actively exhibit abroad, participate in large international shows, and tour Europe and the United States with lectures and demonstrations. However, the shift in their thinking could also be seen in the ways calligraphers conceptualized their art. While from the late 1940s, it was the concept of the rainbow that was a guiding principle of the Bokujinkai's international effort, from the late 1950s, another metaphor comes to replace it. This is another calligraphy by Morita Shiryū, and it contains three characters, Ryū, or dragon-nosed dragon, where one dragon stands for the east and another one for the west. It represents a cultural encounter between East and West, and Morita used this phrase very often for his international shows. However, here, unlike in the rainbow, two dragons remain two separate animals with distinct characteristics and meanings. As Morita explained, in the West, dragon is a figure of terror to be conquered by St. George, while in the East, it has quite positive implications. The way Morita juxtaposes these two dragons only highlights the difference between them. As a trace of the post-war cultural diplomacy, Morita's dragons inhabited many art institutions all over the world, including the Art Institute in Chicago, Kyoto International House, several collections in Europe, as well as numerous private collections. Yet the message they conveyed was the same everywhere. Eastern dragon, or calligraphy, will remain in the East, and Western dragon, or abstract painting, will remain in the West. They can meet and admire each other, and their encounter can form a spectacular scene, yet they will never become one and will eventually go back to their separate domains. At this point, it became obvious that European and American abstract painters and Japanese avant-garde calligraphers, despite seemingly large common ground, were not capable or willing to engage in a substantial art dialogue. By the 1960s, even the passionate supporters of cooperation between calligraphers and painters had to state that the gap between these two art forms was too big to be breached by sheer enthusiasm. In his book Abstract Painting, French art critic Michel Souffort visualized Morita's fears of the rainbow between calligraphy and abstract painting falling apart in an even more picturesque metaphor. Quote, in the 1960s, every abstract painter is fascinated by the East, dreams of visiting Japan, perhaps to find the delights of Japanese calligraphy. Certainly, there is nothing to object to in the effort to build a bridge between East and West. There can be few more urgent tasks to be completed. For my part, however, the bridges I see being built are paper ones, no more substantial than the streamers of confetti thrown out on popular holidays. End quote. With time, the gap between calligraphy and painting increased, and the distance separating calligraphy from modern art scene only became larger. So while in the early post-war years, calligraphers were part of the global avant-garde, regarded on par with abstract painters and engaging in common visual and artistic challenges, including political rivalries, later calligraphers became relocated into a more isolated but also more protected position of Zen-inspired East Asian cultural practice, which can be admired but hardly fathomed or penetrated by foreigners. This later narrative shift in art criticism and exhibition practice, as well as self-withdrawal of Japanese calligraphers from the international art exchange, have led to the fact that nowadays the deep connections between Japanese calligraphy and abstract painting from Europe and the United States seem virtually forgotten. And this is also why today we are surprised when we encounter calligraphy that does not look like calligraphy. Yet it is necessary for us to reconsider this page of art history and to include post-war Japanese calligraphy in our picture of modern art of Japan and the world, but also of the international abstract art movement and political atmosphere of the post-war years that shaped encounters between art forms and artists across the globe. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening.